this strategy is only for long-term wealth creation, because by the time you pay your stamp duty, by the time you pay your purchase costs, you really need to hold the asset for a long period of time to realize the benefits in a negative gearing strategy.
Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics such as investing, cash flow, budgeting, saving, passive income, debt management, and much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I'm Billy and I'm joined by my co-host,
Andrew. Bills, here we are back again, and we are talking all about negative gearing today.
Andrew, we are back again, week in, week out on the 360 Money Matters podcast, and can't wait to talk to everyone about negative gearing because, especially in this environment at the moment, if you've got an investment property with interest rates that have gone up, you're probably feeling a greater impact of the negatively gearing. So we just thought we'd talk about that and unpack that a little bit in some more detail, talk about the pros, the cons, the good, the bad, the ugly, and do a bit of a deeper dive on that to get some more information across to our viewers and our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Andrew, kick us off. What is negative gearing?
So negative gearing is basically making an income loss, primarily on a property. So we're talking generally in relation to property today, but making an investment or an income loss on a property.
Just pause there a sec for dramatic effect, right? So you're entering into some form of investment with the expectation to make a loss. Now, that doesn't make sense to me.
I mean, look, there's negative gearing where you intend to do negative gearing, and there's negative gearing when you bought property at 2% interest rates and then now it's 6%. So not always intentional, but for a lot of the time, it is an intentional strategy. So negative gearing is whereby you're making an income loss on the property year in, year out, but your expectation is that you're making capital growth. So the value of the asset is increasing. Now, a few terms in that. So let's unpack it a little bit. And I think the easiest way to do it is just with an example. You buy a property and let's say it's a $700,000 property, right? It's an investment property. Now, I'm going to exclude, stamp duty, cost of acquisition, all of that stuff, and say that your total purchase price was $700,000. Now, let's say on that property, you're receiving rental income of $20,000 a year. Then let's say on that same property, all of your mortgage expense, all of your expenses around maintenance, your water, all of your expenses in maintaining the property is $30,000 in a year.
Yep.
Now, what's happened is you've made a $10,000 capital or $10,000 income loss. Mm-hmm. So when you go and do your tax return, you're going to claim a $10,000 tax deduction because you've effectively made a loss on an investment. Now, why you do it, or why someone would intentionally enter into a negative gearing strategy, is that $700,000 property has maybe gone up in value and it's now worth $750,000 a year later. So all of a sudden, you've made $50,000 in a capital gain. Now, because you haven't sold that property, you're not paying any tax. There's no implications with that. And you're not actually realizing any benefit until you actually sell it. But you've, in essence, made a gain on paper of $50,000. Mm-hmm. And you've made an income loss of $10,000 on that property.
Yep.
So you're claiming, which you're then claiming a tax deduction on, and depending on your taxable income, maybe you're getting, $3,000 or $4,000 in tax back as a result of it. So you're claiming a tax deduction while still building your wealth at the very same time.
Okay, so let me just wrap that up. So in the simplest form, you purchase a property because of the costs associated with the property versus the rental income that you'll receive. You're making a cash flow loss each and every year that you can then claim as a tax deduction with your taxes to basically get a tax benefit, with the expectation that over a medium to longer period of time, the capital growth of that property will well and truly outstrip each and every year's income loss to eventually pay back in spades.
Correct. And then you also couple that into the fact of, you can decide. So when you're making an income gain, so let's say you're earning more rental income than what your expenses are, which is positive gearing. In that instance, you don't get to choose when you make that gain because you're making it every single year. You can't have rental income up here and then down here. And, that doesn't really fluctuate over time. Maybe has a little bit in the last 12 months, but generally speaking, rental income doesn't fluctuate. So you're making that each and every single year and you can't time it. Whereas when you're doing a negative gearing strategy, you can say, oh, okay, well, I've got a spouse or my family is going to stop working for 12 months because we're going overseas. So I'm going to sell a property and incur the capital gain then and potentially not pay any capital gains tax. Or I have a spouse that's going on, a paternity leave. And so you're going to sell a property then while the income is lower and not receiving any income over that period of time. So you can time when you pay the tax if you're doing a negative gearing strategy, whereas a positive gearing strategy, you're paying the tax every single year, regardless of whether you want to or don't.
Yep. Okay. So benefits associated with the strategy. Obviously, the tax loss perspective. And I think this is something that we've come across a fair bit where you hear the old story where somebody goes to do their tax return with their accountant and were complaining that, hey, I'm paying too much tax. So, and I could never really understand this if I'm completely honest, but you go to your accountant, yep, we've got a solution. Go and buy a property, get negatively geared, and we'll claim the loss as a tax deduction. This is probably more of a drawback than a positive, but so let me just stick on the positive. But essentially, you're then claiming whatever that loss is to reduce your assessable income to pay less tax.
Yeah. And look, some of the strategies that some people will deploy is purchasing property that is, for instance, a brand new property and a brand new build.
Yeah.
So one of the benefits of that in this strategy is you can claim depreciation on a brand new property.
Yep.
So depreciation is the value of the build decreasing over time. Now, you don't actually incur a loss on depreciation because the vast majority of time property increases in value. But when you're doing your tax return and when you're actually claiming that from a tax perspective, you will be claiming depreciation as an expense. So there are instances where your cash flow might actually be positive.
Yep.
Your rental income might actually be more than what you're actually paying in expenses on the property. However, the depreciation on the property is what's converting it into a negatively gearing property. And so you're effectively getting a tax deduction despite the fact that you're in a positive cash flow position.
Yeah, and I might just call that out. That's probably more on the drawback side, but while you've mentioned it, that's using things like depreciation schedules then becomes an easy tool for off-the-plan property people to be able to use to be able to justify the case of the cash flow case associated with buying an off-the-plan property. Yeah. Because, like I said, going back to what we've all heard, $50 a week out of pocket, why wouldn't you buy a property worth XYZ? We'll get to some of those drawbacks. I really like the one about being able to time the capital gains tax. So if if you're deploying this strategy and you've got a property, using your example before, you buy a property for $700,000, if a property price doubles in 10 years time, fast forward 10 years, it's now worth 1.4 mil. You might be doing that in a particular time when, you're not working, you're retired, paternity leave, time off, whatever it may be. Being able to time it, I think, is like any asset, is definitely critical, because that way you can also influence the tax that you're paying. So you're trying to do it in a year where you've got less taxable income in your name.
Yeah. One of the one of the sort of big things to call out in this is when you're doing a negative gearing strategy, if that is part of, or if that, which we'll run through, who some of the people are that can benefit from this and some of the minimum requirements that you probably need in order to be able to deploy a strategy like this. But one of the really big things to consider is if you're owning a property through a trust, which is starting to become a little bit more common these days, you cannot distribute losses.
Yeah.
So a trust is effectively a vehicle that's going to hold the asset. And anytime that a trust makes a profit, it needs to distribute it out to the owners of the trust. But you're unable to distribute the losses out. So if you have a negatively geared property in a trust, it can only offset any other income that you're generating in the trust outside of that property. And if all that's in that trust is a property, well, then you can't distribute any of the losses. And so effectively, you're negating any of the tax benefits by holding a negatively geared property through a trust.
Yeah, so I guess just, the takeout from that is if you're considering something like this, then you just need to really get some advice around how you structure it, because if you put it in the wrong structure, you could be effectively going through this exercise and diluting all of the benefit that would have been possible.
And even if, it's important to get advice on the structure of it regardless, because even if you're just buying an investment property and the intention isn't to negatively gear it, well, what happens in an environment where you're buying a property at 2% interest rates, it's now gone to 6-7%, and all of a sudden what wasn't a consideration when you're talking about negative gearing is a consideration, but your costs of changing the holding structure and capital gains and stamp duty and all of that stuff is just doesn't make it worthwhile. So some forward planning is really important regardless of how you're looking to structure it.
And I think that's a great pivot into some of the drawbacks that we should talk about, Andrew. Obviously you're in a negative cash flow position. That's understandable. That is probably something that wasn't necessarily too big of a consideration previously, but you go and couple it with the environment that we're in now, where we're seeing inflation, albeit, starting to stabilize, but we saw the cost of everything go up really rapidly. All of a sudden, your negative cash flow position of $100 a week or $200 a week may not be too big of a consideration because you've got enough fat in your budget to be able to manage that. But all of a sudden, everything starts getting more expensive. That cash flow position starts to deteriorate even further.
Yeah.
Probably something that can't be understated. And, I guess when we talk about who this strategy is right for and the things that you consider, talking about, predictable cash flow, job security, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I don't think we can understate the negative cash flow element of it, because it's not as simple in today's environment it was what it was previously.
Yeah, and it's important to note what has happened over the last, say, 12 to 18 months should serve as a cautionary tale when you're talking about, future events. So if you told anyone, say, 18 months ago that inflation was going to reach the point that it did, and then at the same time interest rates were also going to rise to the point that they did, someone who's deployed a negative gearing strategy, who might have been out of, their cash flow position might have only been $10,000 a year or $5,000 a year negative cash flow position, say 8 to 18 months ago, is now probably looking at a negative cash flow position of, 30, 40 grand.
Yeah.
We're not talking about, small changes. We're talking about a very significant change. And even if that's temporary, even if that's something that only lasts 12 months or 2 years or 3 years until things revert back to normality, if you're in a negative cash flow position and you don't have a buffer and you don't have significant contingencies in place, you might not get the option to be able to ride it out, and you might be forced into a position where you need to sell an asset. And really, this strategy is only for long-term wealth creation, because by the time you pay your stamp duty, by the time you pay your purchase costs, you really need to hold the asset for a long period of time to realize the benefits in a negative gearing strategy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you've hit the nail on the head with the next drawback that I want to talk about is picking the right type of property to be able to achieve this. So I alluded to earlier about the depreciation schedules and potentially buying stuff off the plan because it can look so attractive on paper. The challenge that you may have, and what we're seeking with a negatively geared strategy, is you want the property to achieve capital appreciation. You need capital growth. Yeah. So if you go and enter into this and you're not achieving the capital growth that you've expected, then the strategy is pointless. You're basically going backwards.
You're going backwards,
yep.
right? Yeah.
Yep. So I think that's a really big drawback, is making sure that you choose the right property. And, for the majority of people, I think it's fair to say that, we probably don't know what constitutes a good property in terms of what's going to grow from a negative gearing perspective. It's easy enough to mitigate. because, you can get a buyer's advocate and get some professional assistance and stuff like that. But definitely from my perspective, choosing the wrong property could be a huge risk and a huge drawback.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's pivotal in all of this, because the entire strategy relies on the property increasing in value. If that doesn't happen,
what's the point?
Yeah, what's the point? And really an important note is you're significantly increasing your risk when you're deploying a strategy like this. I mean, in order to have a negatively geared property, for the vast majority of the time, you need to be at pretty high LVRs. Like the loan needs to be at a fairly high value in comparison to...
Well, mathematically, the higher the better.
When you're looking at a negative gearing strategy.
Yep.
I mean, if your loan is like, if you've got $1 million property and your loan's only $300,000, well, the expenses on a $300,000 loan aren't going to cover the rental income that you're receiving on $1 million property. So in order to do this, you have to have a relatively high LVR. And if your LVR is higher, your risk is significantly higher, which can mean that there's an opportunity for a greater return, but it also means that there's an opportunity for a significantly greater risk as well. Because if the property market moves in the other direction, and if things come backwards rather than increasing in value, so if you incur capital losses and you're incurring an income loss every single year, your losses are fairly significant. It's not, just a $5,000-$10,000 a year income loss that you're receiving. It can be fairly significant.
The thing that always makes me smile about this, an extension of what you're talking about, is negative. Like, yeah, no worries. The maths make sense. I'm only out of pocket $50, $100, $200 a week, whatever it is. But it's the signing on the dotted line for a mortgage of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it's just like, maybe not in today's environment, but some of the stuff that we've seen where people have just been flippant in terms of their thinking and, I'll do it. It makes sense. I get it. Here's, let me sign up to a mortgage, $600,000, no dramas. And all of a sudden, and I'm going to be losing money on that property to eventually make a capital gain. I just think the whole thing, maybe it's our fascination with property in Australia. I just always found the whole thing fascinating. And if it's done correctly, don't get me wrong, it works and it's a really worthwhile strategy. And we recommend it and we deploy it to clients in the right scenario, which is probably a good segue into things to consider and who is it right for. But I just always found that fascinating. Maybe it's just a human trait thing
I think I also find it incredibly fascinating with all of this that it can become very easy to just lose sight of rationality. So a lot of the times people will, not a lot of the times, but I've seen instances where people have intentionally rented a property out lower so that they can negatively gear a property, or incur expenses on a property so that they can negatively gear a property. And the analogy that I use is, are you better off making $100 and paying $30 in tax, and so you're left with $70, or losing $100 and getting $30 back and you're still at a $70 loss? If you can achieve a positively geared property and have the same capital appreciation, that's a far better strategy than negatively gearing a property and getting the same capital growth. So
I don't know why I thought you were going to drop the F-bomb then.
Well, you're passionate. I'm not that passionate. We would have bleeped it out. But look, if you can do positive gearing and still, yes, your taxable income might be slightly higher, but that's perfectly fine. I mean, paying tax, minimizing your tax while still making a profit is great, but intentionally losing money in order to be able to claim a tax deduction is just ridiculous.
Yeah. Considerations. Who should be looking at this?
Yeah, look, the first thing is your cash flow has to support it. And when I say support it, I don't mean you're in a positive cash flow position of $10,000 a year, let's negatively gear a property of, $5,000 a year. You need to have significant contingencies in place. So you have to have a cash flow position that is significantly higher than the negative gearing. And there isn't a set dollar amount and there isn't a set percentage or anything like that. You need to look at it on an individual basis. But when you're talking about not just cash flow, you're also talking about, okay, owning a property is going to incur expenses because there's going to be maintenance, there's going to be things that go wrong, there's going to be expenses that you're not going to be able to predict with any form of certainty. So you need to have funds that are available to be able to do it, and you need to expect that to happen. So cash flow and contingencies in terms of money put aside for repairs, maintenance, increases in interest rates, increases in expenses, all of that stuff is probably the most important thing when you're deploying a negative gearing strategy.
Yep. I definitely think that's at the top of the list. The second thing that I tend to think of is within your own personal life, and this is probably not something that's brought up enough, but you need to have, I think, really good discipline and strong comfort levels around your money management. Because that then alludes to what you were talking about. If you're not, and something happens in your personal life and you need to dig into your surplus income that you've got each month, if you need to dig into your liquidity or emergency funds, all of a sudden, if something happens with the property and you don't get the income that you need for that particular month or a few months in a row, or maybe there's a body corporate that sits over the top and they put a bill in to repair something, all of a sudden your income fluctuates, then you're left in a bit of a jam. So having discipline around, I think, your money management in your personal life is a requirement as well too, because it can impact the strategy, or the strategy can impact your personal life.
Yeah. And on that, I mean, when you're talking about your personal life and you're talking about all of the things that can go wrong, having adequate insurances in place is super important. So you need to make sure that you've got, income protection insurance. Something happens to your health and you're unable to work. Well, all of a sudden that negative cash flow position was getting funded from an income that you were deriving by working. And so you need to be able to cover that. Your life insurances, your permanent disability cover, your trauma insurances, making sure that you've got personal insurances in place to be able to cover any negative cash flow positions if something was to happen, you're unable to work.
Yep. Risk tolerance. Needing to have the appetite for risk, I think, is absolutely critical. And I think it's something, like I said, that's been overlooked. In a lower interest rate environment where borrowing $600,000, borrowing $1 million was no big deal. Definitely think that your risk tolerance and really understanding what that is and what that means needs to be of a certain caliber, because coming back, you are going to sign on the dotted line for a mortgage that's going to cost you, X amount of dollars to service. You're not going to, you buy an asset, you're going to be in a negative asset position from day one because you've paid, in most instances, you've paid stamp duty. So even if you buy it today and sell it tomorrow, you're going to lose money. You need time to at least recover the costs that you've put into it. So risk tolerance is definitely one from my perspective, getting a real understanding of what that looks like and making sure, and as we try to, communicate to people, making sure that you understand the risks that you're taking and that you can meet the sleep test, especially in a higher interest rate environment, is critical.
Billy, you said sleep test and you didn't, there was no pitch for a sponsorship deal for 40 Winks. There was no, what's going on?
So we're a little bit rusty, Andrew, because whoever says it, the other person needs to then,
sorry,
right? That was on you, not on me. Okay. So you missed it, but yes, good pickup. And we still managed to get 40 Winks in there. If you're listening, we're still looking for corporate sponsorships. Yeah, that's it.
Look, you touched on it, Billy, but I think honing in on it as well is time frame of holding the asset. You need to be able to let capital growth do its work, and you need to be able to hold the asset for a long period of time. And I'm talking really 10 plus years in order for a strategy like this to be worthwhile. If you've got a short time frame of investment, you buy a property today, it's an investment property. So, unless you're doing things like buying a property, live in it for 12 months and then move out and it becomes investment. So I'm just going to assume that stamp duty is going to happen in every scenario here. You're paying your stamp duty costs in year one. If you sell the property, you're paying agent fees. There's other costs in potentially needing to, advertise and all of that stuff. So your costs are going to be, or your purchase price of the asset is going to be more than what the asset is worth in day one. And you need to be able to ride that wave in order to be able to really realize the benefits of capital appreciation. So you need to have the time frame of being able to hold the asset as well.
The higher the income earner, so the higher your tax bracket, the better off the strategy does from a negatively gearing perspective. So throughout the years that you hold the property.
Yeah.
But then when it comes to the eventual sale, and depending on the ownership structure and who receives the proceeds of the capital gain from the sale, it's the opposite.
Yeah. Which makes a very interesting conundrum. And I kind of love working through this because there's so many conflicting things when you're trying to deploy this strategy for a lot of people. When you're talking about disparity of income in a couple, it's it's a doozy because you've got, as Billy was alluding to, you want to hold the asset in the name of the person that's making the least amount of money because you want the income that's derived from that asset to be deployed to the person that's making a lower income. But then when you sell the asset, you want it to be held in the name of a person that's earning the lowest amount of money because capital gain, it's the other way around. And then on the flip side, you also can't utilize the benefits like this. You culminate all of that and say, a trust, perfect. You can choose who the income gets distributed to. But then in the trust, you can't utilize the benefits of negative gearing. So trying to do the numbers, and it takes a little bit of prediction, it takes a little bit of modeling to be able to work out how you actually do it. And sometimes it's just 50-50 and sometimes it's one way or another. But it's a very interesting conversation because it really can go either way depending on your scenario, depending on the type of property, depending on the level of negative gearing as to who actually you hold the asset in the name of if you've got the choice.
Very interesting one to get your head around.
Yeah.
Should we go as far and stipulate, I guess, what our personal thoughts are around? This is pretty dangerous, Andrew. I might put you on the spot here in terms of what it would look like for the person. So if I'm if I'm a single person and I'm earning $80,000 a year, just knowing how much stuff costs, there's not enough room in my budget. I'll go out there and say that, right? If I'm in a relationship and we're both earning $80,000 and we've got $30,000 household surplus each year, plus we've got money to put down as a deposit, we've got money left over, we've got our insurances in place, we've got our risk tolerance assessed and we're comfortable with it, that probably ticks a little bit more boxes.
I think you're on the line. I mean, even when you're talking about surplus cash flow position, level of income, you're really on the line as to whether this is actually deplorable. If I'm being perfect, and that's not everyone's situation, but just
in that instance, what would you be looking for, or what is it that's? I mean, in that, there's probably a little bit more to unpack. What's your family situation? Is there additional expenses in the form of, house relocation? Is there change to your family circumstances where you might have children? There might be gaps in work with children, study, holidays, you name it. Do you own your own owner-occupier? There's probably a lot more to it.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also need to look at the alternative, right? Like, let's consider you've got a deposit to put down on a property and say that deposit's $200,000. And say that your negative cash flow, your negative gearing is at a rate of, $10,000 a year, just because that's a number that we've been utilizing.
Yep.
Okay, well, one of the other considerations is rather than putting $200,000 into a property and negative gearing $10,000 a year, what if you, on the flip side of it, just say, okay, what if I take $200,000, invest it in XYZ investment, right? Like pick your ETF, shares, term deposits, bonds, whatever you want to invest in. Yep. And then also invest not just the $200,000, but what would have been your negative cash flow position and say, okay, I then put $10,000 a year in additional contributions towards that investment. Which one of those scenarios is actually going to play out better? Yep. Not just financially, which one's going to work out better, but also, which one is going to play out better when you're taking into consideration the risk that's associated with it. An investment in a negatively geared property, you're a payment to your payment and you don't have any control over that other than potentially making some, moving it over to interest only or doing things like that that has its own risks in it. But you're stuck there and you're in that investment for the next 30 years and you're not making any changes. Whereas a strategy whereby you're deploying your surplus income into investment contributions, you can dial that up, down, take withdrawals out of it if you need it. So really, it's important to consider not just is this a strategy that can work, but is this the best strategy for my situation? And that's when you start to work out, or that's when you start to map it out and look at financially which one's going to likely yield a better result, but also taking into account the level of risk that you're taking when you're going through it as well.
So if that was too long, didn't listen, get advice, basically, because there's a level of complexity associated with it. And in today's environment where the whole world is more volatile, interest rates are higher, cost of living is higher, I think making that decision in today's environment to purchase a negatively geared property needs a lot more consideration than maybe it did back in the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want this podcast to kind of sound like we're just doom and gloom on negative gearing, because we're not.
No, we're pro-advice, though.
Very, very...
Yeah, we're pro-advice and pro going into any financial decision with information, with an understanding, with education, with advice.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. And this is a strategy that can absolutely work and can be a very fantastic strategy for wealth creation, just doing it in the right way.
100%. Andrew, well said, well summarised. Thanks for another podcast.
Thanks, Billy. Yeah. Appreciate it. And thanks to all of our listeners and viewers for jumping on. If you have any questions, feel free to touch base, or any topics that you'd like us to discuss. But as always, like, subscribe, and look forward to catching you on the next one.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about, or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amaritis and Andrew Nicolou of 360 Financial Strategists Proprietary Limited, authorised representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.